Hey there, welcome to Silversmithing 105. Today we're making a bezel. The first thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to pick out your bezel wire. And this will depend on the type of cabochon that you have. So I'm going to go over that next. All right, here we have the four basic type of cabochons, A, B, C, and D. The first one has a vertical edge and then it sharply transitions to a domed top. So you want to measure that vertical edge there and then add about 1 millimeter or 0.5 millimeter. The next type here has a slanted edge, and if the slanted edge is tall enough, you can simply measure how tall that is and make the bezel the same height if it's at least 3 or 4 millimeters tall. If it's not, you want to go above that just a little bit by about another 0.5 millimeter. Figure C here, we see that we have one that transitions into a nice dome almost immediately. Figure out where the transition starts and then add about 1 millimeter. Figure D, you're going to find where the point is that sticks out the furthest, and then add, again, about another 0.5 millimeter to a full millimeter for your bezel height. In figure E, we can see here that I pointed out that this cabochon has a chamfered edge, which needs to fit in next to the solder joint next to the wall. This is really important because if you don't, then you'll need to burr out the solder joint later down the road so that the sharp edge can fit in there without chipping when you set the stone. So of all of these different cabochon types, figure E is my favorite by far. It has a chamfered edge, a rounded dome top. For my cabochon, I've selected a 3 millimeter tall bezel wire, which you can see will be just enough to get it past the lip of the stone. The sheet that I have here is plenty large enough, so since I'm going to be trimming off all of the extra around the bezel after I've soldered it, I'm going to pre-cut this and take out the section that I need so that I'm not wasting extra silver. Next, I like to have a nice flat surface to work with, so I have my stone sitting on my large anvil plate here, and we're just going to wrap it around the cabochon here. And you see here I've got a nice tight fit. And when I'm happy with that, I'm going to take something like a scribe here and lightly make a mark on the bezel wire so I know where to cut. And it's going to be better if your stone is a little bit looser in the setting rather than too tight, unless you happen to have lapidary equipment and can cut it down later. Next, I'm going to find my mark here and I'm going to cut it off with a pair of shears. You can also use side cutters or jeweler's saw if you don't have shears, but these are my favorite tool for cutting the bezel wire. Now, don't worry about the fact that it sprang back. Go ahead and test it. Make sure that the ends are still lining up, which they are. So now we're ready to go ahead and solder this into a closed loop. Okay, here's my setup. I've got my bezel bent around, and I have my edges perfectly lined up. I set it on a charcoal block to help keep it flat. I've placed a piece of solder directly under the joint and applied flux. Now I've got my fan on, light the torch, and let's go ahead and solder this up. It's definitely worth taking the time to make sure your lines or your ends meet up perfectly. So I'm going to heat this up gradually by aiming at the center. The charcoal block will help to disperse the heat outwards, so I'm heating the whole bezel evenly. I'm watching that solder very closely, and as I feel like it gets closer to the temperature, I can bring the flame over to the joint. Boom. Solder just jumped into the joint and we're done. Go ahead and drop this in the pickle. Now remember, if you're using fine silver for your bezel wire at a 26 or 28 gauge like I am, it's going to be difficult to get that solder to melt without melting your bezel wire. So if you melt your bezel wire down on your first try, don't worry, just start over and try again. Now while I'm waiting for my bezel wire to pickle, I'm just going to go over here to my sheet and cut out the rectangle I need, keeping in mind that you'll need to leave more room on the sheet than the exact size of the cabochon because you want the bezel to sit on top of the sheet. So I'm just going to scribe this in here. You can also use a Sharpie. if you prefer. And again, this is where a pair of shears really comes in handy. Rather than trying to cut that into an L shape, which will just bend it all up, I'm cutting this into 2 pieces, which then could be later used for other small bezels or bales and things of that nature. Plus it keeps this back plate from bending, keeping that nice and flat. Okay, at this point, before you solder the bezel wire onto your back plate, you need to ask yourself what you're going to be making. If you're going to be making a pendant, then before you go any further, you're going to want to put your purity stamp and your maker's mark on the back of the sheet, because it's really hard, if not impossible, to stamp a sheet once it has the bezel wire attached, because you can't set it down on anything without crushing the bezel wire. I know that I'm going to be making a ring, so I prefer to put my purity stamp on the inside of the ring rather than on the back of the bezel, especially since if you attach the ring to the bezel, you might cover up your purity stamp. All right, we have our bezel wire out of the pickle. We've got our sheet there. Now, if you have any bit of a jog in the bezel, you can simply lay down some sandpaper on a really flat surface, like I'm using this steel plate here, and just gently sand it back and forth here. And if you have a jog on one side, it means you have a jog on the other. So you can do both sides. And this is also a great way to just prep the surface for soldering, so you have a nice, clean, totally smooth surface. Don't worry about cleaning up any of the extra solder yet. We will do that later on down the road. So once you're happy and you can run your fingers along here, not feel the jog, we're going to go ahead and test fit our stone here. So you can do this simply by stretching the bezel around your stone until it fits all the way around like that. Now you may notice that then when you take it back off, it's not quite exactly the right shape, and I'm going to show you how to fix that here right now. So we have this problem here. Our stone fits just fine, right? But when we take our bezel off, you can see it's deformed just a tiny bit. So that means if we were to solder it to our sheet as is, later when we try to get the stone in, it wouldn't fit. So what we need to somehow do is get this bezel to stay in the shape that we want it to. So we can push it over the stone. Make sure to check the back of the stone and that the bezel is flush all the way against the back, so you know you have it all the way in there. I'm going to give you an idea here. Zoom in. This is how much bezel is extending out past my stone. You can see I don't have very much, and that's because you don't want to have to push very much metal later on. So I've moved over here to the edge of my table so I can demonstrate what I like to do. Hold it just ever so slightly over the edge of the table, and then with a soft hammer here, I'm just tapping the bezel against the stone as I rotate it very gently. Doing this is going to work hard in that bezel, and it's going to set it in this exact shape. Now, this is really easy to do with most hard stones like agates and jaspers, which is the type of stone I recommend starting out with because they're, 1, inexpensive and readily available, 2, they're really durable. Now, if you're doing this with another type of stone like an opal, you would need to be extremely careful or figure out another way of work hardening it. And they actually sell bezel mandrels specifically for shaping bezels with it, but it only works on calibrated stones. So once you've gone it around a couple of times here, you should be able to lift off the bezel, and it should keep the exact shape. And you can test this by simply setting it over the stone and seeing how much it flexes when you set it over the stone, and it shouldn't really flex at all. So I'm having a small amount of flex here. So I need to tap this just a little bit more around on this side to get it to hold the shape that I want. If you don't do this step and take the time to make sure the bezel is the right shape, then later on your stone won't fit, and unless you have a backup stone that you can recut, you'll be pretty much have to start over. So this part's pretty important. Okay, actually, it's really important. There we go. So now I can set the bezel around the stone here, and it sits right on there, not a problem. So I'm ready to move on to the next step. Next, you're going to want to make sure that your bezel is, of course, lying flat. And that means that there's no light shining underneath it, and so we can check that here. So here we can see the bezel is nice and flat on the surface of this table. There's no gaps. And I can set it on my sheet here, and the sheet is nice and flat, no gaps. So that's really important for the soldering, which is the next step. So once you're happy with your bezel, we're going to go ahead and solder it down, and we'll do that in the next step, part of this video. Okay, here's my soldering setup. This is a soldering tripod. It's pretty simple. It has a mesh grate on top, which you can put your work on. This allows you to heat it from the bottom and the top and the sides, which is perfect for this type of soldering operation. So I'm going to go ahead and get my solder ready, and then I'll go ahead and take another video showing the arrangement of the solder. So here's my plate here. I've got it fluxed, and you can see I have solder placed all around the outside edge. You can do it on the inside too. The reason why I prefer the outside is because after we solder this, I'm going to be trimming off all the excess plate on the outside of the bezel. So if the solder overflows onto that plate, it's not a big deal. I'm going to be cutting it off anyways. And it's also far easier to sand off the outside of this bezel than it is off the inside. Okay, I have my fume extraction hood running. I've got my torch on. This is a pretty large piece, and 20 gauge is fairly thick, but I have 20 gauge for this because this is such a large cabochon. It needs a lot of support. If you're using a smaller cabochon, you can use lighter gauge material. Now be patient. Just like we did with the ring, we're going to heat this up evenly. So now we're heating from the bottom, because I'm more focused on warming up the sheet than I am on the bezel wire. The bezel wire will overheat and melt much faster than the sheet. So as the flux melts, sometimes it will push your solder away. If that happens, continue to heat it. And once that flux gets a little runny again, you can push that solder back up against the bezel wire. Remember, you want it to be touching both the bezel wire and the sheet. Sometimes it can get a bit sticky. That's pretty normal. Just take your time. Also, when I soldered my bezel wire, I used hard solder, and now I'm using medium solder. I'm keeping an eye. This is my original solder joint here. I don't want that solder joint to melt. So this is why I'm using medium solder now. I'm going to start watching and keeping an eye on my workpiece, evenly heating. And then I'm going to transition the heat up to the top and start heating both the sheet and the bezel at the same time. I can see my solder melting here as I'm going around. Once I have got that solder melted all the way around, I can turn off the torch. I'm looking for gaps in the solder wall, making sure that the solder has flowed all the way around. Once I've done that, I can turn off the torch and transfer the piece into my pickle. All right, we've got our bezel backing here out of the pickle. It's looking good. You'll notice that I marked the top of mine after I pulled it out. It's because even though this looks like it should be symmetrical one way or the other, it's not quite. I know the first thing you're probably going to want to do is like, ooh, let's see if this fits. But before you do that, I want you to think about that for a moment. Because if it goes in there and if it's a very tight fit, you might have a lot of trouble getting it back out again. In fact, it's one of the questions I see pop up in forums all the time is, help, my bezel and my cabochon are stuck and I'm not ready to set it yet. How do I get it out? So the way you would do this to test it is you're going to lay something across here like a piece of dental floss, perhaps 2 or 3 strands, and then push your stone in. And then you can pull on the floss to get your stone back out again. So that's real important. So we're going to go ahead and trim off the extra here. Now this is the point where if you were wanting to add more decorations like a rope border or something else around here, then you would go ahead and do that next. But for this class, I'm simply teaching how to make a simple bezel. So I'm going to go ahead and use these shears to cut off the extra. Try not to cut too close to your bezel wall, because if you do, you can accidentally damage it, but you want to get as close as you can because that's going to minimize the amount of work that you have to do afterwards to clean it all up. And all this scrap silver can later be put to use making other little bits and pieces, droplets, and that sort of thing, which I'm going to cover actually in a future video, and you'll want to look at that because it's actually going to be on the final project of this class. Now, I know that I didn't include shears as one of the tools, so I'm also going to show how you would go about sawing this off. This is called a bench pin. It's a very simple standard device. They're very inexpensive. It simply consists of a piece of wood. Usually they have a forked end and something sturdy to set it into. And some of them get clamped down, some of them not. And this simply provides a good place to rest your work against a flat surface where then you can start sawing into it. And the wood allows you to run the saw into the wood without dulling your saw. So I'm simply going to start here and start sawing around. Now I'm using a number 0 saw blade here because I'm cutting through sheet, and this sheet is, I believe it's 20 gauge, so that's 0.8 millimeters. So you want the saw blade to be thinner so that it matches. So you have at least 2 saw blade or 2 saw teeth in contact with the sheet at all times. So you're just going to go all the way around. You can cut it off in little pieces, but that would be the way to do this with a saw. Naturally, if you have a pan of vise, then you clamp it into the pan of vise. But since I have shears, we're just going to go ahead and snip this because it is way faster. And when you're a professional jeweler, time is money. And there we go. So here's our bezel. The overall shape is done. We just need to file off all this excess. I'm back at the pan of ice here, and the important thing to remember about bezel walls is that they're thin and soft, and they're thin and soft for a reason. And that's because we're going to want to be able to push this over our stone later. It also means you have to exercise a lot of care. So I'm going to put this in my pan of ice, and now it's firm. Just going to a little bit more, and that's all you want to do. So I'm going to go ahead, and I have a file here with a safe edge along this edge and serrations along here. I can use my finger to help guide the file. And by constantly rotating the angle of the file here, I don't create any flat spots. I also have the file tilted slightly away so that I don't file away my bezel wall. I'm only filing away the extra backing material. Obviously, if you file away your bezel wall, you can't add it back in again. Naturally, you can also use your handpiece if you want to. The advantage to the handpiece is it's going to be a lot faster and it's going to leave a smoother finish. The file is slower, but it's going to give you a lot more control. The one technique that a lot of people use when they're using a handpiece is remember to use a tripod type stance here. So I have a lot more control by pivoting my fingers around and by having at least 2 fingers on the workpiece and also touching my hand, because if I just hold it freehand like this in the air, I don't have a lot of control over it. The more points of contact I have, the better. So here, I'm using my thumb to actually move this back and forth across here. And that's going to give me even strokes back and forth so I don't get any flat spots, which I don't want. So go ahead and round off and finish off your edge so that it is flush and you cannot see the seam between the backing plate and the bezel wall. And then we'll continue. So I've got my edge filed down all the way around. The next thing I want to do is put a uniform finish on it so I can see if there's any high or low spots. So I'm just going to take this to about a 600 grit using some sandpaper. You can also use a satin wheel if you happen to have one of those. So now we can see I have a nice uniform finish. There's not any lines or seams in between my solder joints. And for this is as good as you want to go. I just need to finish up the back side, but I wanted to show you the progress here. Now you may have a little bit of fire scale, and that is the slight discoloration that you're seeing here. The pinkish color on the silver. But that's going to come out during the final buffing stage. Okay, so we've got our bezel done here. Nice uniform finish. I'm not too worried about polishing at this stage because we still have at least one more soldering step to do, which we're going to do in the next class. As you might have already noticed, a bezel like this really is not useful. There's no bail for a pennant and there's no ring shank for a finger. So at this stage, it's not terribly useful. We'll need to add something to this in order to make it into finished jewelry. And since we're going to be doing more soldering and more pickling, there's no point in doing a final polish just yet. However, getting it down to a nice uniform finish around 600 grit or 800 grit does show us if we've completely soldered it, if the seam goes all the way around, and if it's ready to go, because later we're not going to want to have to do a lot of extra touch-up once we're finished soldering. So I'm going to be using the ring shank that I made in a previous class, or one very similar to it. If you still have yours, you can use that too. And we're going to solder this onto that ring shank in the next class. So I'll see you there.